Welcome to the English Epics channel. Thank you for coming, sis. Are the kids okay? Yes, they're fine, Sarah. Mick is keeping an eye on them. When I left, they were sound asleep. Did you ask him about the money for bail? The police said it would. Be around $50,000, but you'll get it back once the charges are dropped. About that? Mick asked why Dave isn't paying, and I have to say I'm curious about that too. Well, I'm kind of hoping this will all be resolved before Dave gets back, in 2 days. Honestly, it's all a misunderstanding. Once Paul wakes up, he'll clear everything up and the charges will be dropped. There's no need to stress Dave out. Who's Paul? I think you'd better start your little story from the very beginning, don't? You think? A disheveled woman on the other side of the interrogation room bars in the holding cell looked very uncomfortable, mentally bracing herself for the upcoming conversation. In recent days, she had thought a lot about talking about this, or something similar, with her husband, Dave, but there was no one else to confide in. Now she needed to shed light on what she had done. Perhaps, given her current circumstances, it seemed a bit dirty even in her own eyes, not to mention selfish, but she had to lay it all out to get her sister's help and avoid having this conversation with Dave. Breaking eye contact, Sarah Brown began her story. Paul is my work husband. What the hell is a work husband? Oh, Wendy, you've always been a bit of a prude. These days, it's trendy. Damn it. Many girls in my office have work husbands. I'll ask again. What the hell is a work husband? Sarah sighed. Why the hell was her sister stuck in the dark ages? Well, I think it's just a distraction. A way to relieve stress or boredom at work. A guy in the office dates one of the girls, and at work they act like husband and wife. Wendy stared at her sister skeptically. How much like a husband and wife? Oh, you know. We look out for each other, tell him when his fly's down, cheer him, up when he's feeling down, go to lunch together and things like that. And what about the more popular things husbands and wives do? Sarah thought quickly. Could she avoid telling her sister more? No, she concluded. The rest of the story couldn't be kept secret, and without full disclosure, none of this would make sense. She mentally prepared herself for the inevitable judgment. Well, yeah, just sex during work, you know, or sometimes pretending we're working late and doing it in the office after everyone's left. But it only happened 4 or 5 times. Mostly, it was just in a motel room across the street during extended lunch breaks. Saying it out loud, Sarah began to realize how pathetic her reasoning sounded. She avoided looking Wendy in the eyes and fell silent. And this time, it wasn't an extended lunch break or working late. You called me after midnight. Ah, I get it. Dave was out of town on a business trip, wasn't he? So this was a case of lying. To your sister. To get her to babysit your kids while you spent the whole night with your so-called work husband, wasn't it? Sarah's downward glance was the only response Wendy needed. And how many times have I had to watch your kids while you were betraying your husband? I'm not happy about being made an accomplice, you know? I swear, Wendy, it was the first time. Honestly, if Wendy had to place a bet, she would still consider her sister truthful by nature. Why is that, sis? Is this the first time his wife has been away? No, he's not married. Well, then everything's fine. At least he's not committing adultery. Relieved that the worst seemed to be over, Sarah let her sister's sarcasm slide and answered without hesitation. No, he's a decent guy. He'd never do something like that. Sarah's brain finally caught. Up with her mouth and her face turned beet red. Wendy just looked at her younger sister and shook her head, thinking once again about how their parents had spoiled their youngest child. And what about your husband? What about Dave? What are you going to say when it's him sitting across from you, not me? For a moment, Sarah panicked. I told you if you get me out of here in the morning, Paul will wake up and tell the police what really happened. Then Dave will never have to find out, unless, of course, I tell him. Wendy paused before adding. Or Mick. If you do this, the potential collapse of my family will be on your shoulders. The kids will be left without a father because of you. Sarah looked defiantly at Wendy, who stared back in disbelief. She knew. Her younger sister had always struggled to take responsibility for her mistakes, but this was ridiculous. Fine, you're wrong, Sarah. But even if Mick and I don't say anything, Dave will catch you eventually. In the end, cheaters always get caught. What was your plan if he finds out? I hadn't even thought about it until one evening last week when Dave almost caught Paul and me. What happened? I called Dave and told him he'd have to make dinner for the kids because I was working late. But it wasn't work, was it? Wendy, already knowing the answer, couldn't hide her disappointment in her younger sister. Sarah, however, didn't notice a thing. No. The office was empty, and the front door to the building was locked. But that damn cleaning lady let Dave in, the stupid fool. He brought me dinner. Luckily, Paul had just finished bending me over the desk, and thankfully, I had the sense to lock my office door. When Dave knocked, I had to hold my underwear tightly to keep anything from dripping onto the floor. Paul and I got ourselves presentable in record time, and I opened the door. Lucky Dave is so naive that he bought our story about the door accidentally, locking. Wendy flinched and just shook her head. So, after your brilliant evasion, what was your clever plan in case Dave actually caught you? Well, according to my friend Jen, I don't need to do anything. If Dave kicks me out, I'll get everything. Custody of the kids, the house, alimony. Apparently, as long as the mother isn't in prison, she gets it all. My plan was simply to point that out to Dave, because then he'd never leave me. He lives for the kids. I don't think you'll need to explain that to him, Sarah, especially after what his first wife put him through. Both of them reflected on the well-known tragic story of Dave's first marriage, an ambush by his wife and her lover, a lawyer. Fabricated. Accusations of physical abuse that allowed his ex-wife to secure a full restraining order. Constant whispers in the children's ears until they eventually refused to speak to their father, even over the phone. Wendy had tears in her eyes as she sympathized with Dave's hopeless situation. She felt ashamed to be related to Sarah. How could Sarah even think of doing something like that to her husband? You're right, Sarah. It will destroy him if he has. To go through this again. Exactly. Wendy stared at the despicable creature her sister had become and felt an overwhelming urge to wipe that smirk off her face. Then again, you never know for sure. Dave is smart. He might come up with a solution that will catch you off guard. No, Wendy. The worst thing that could happen is that I lose Dave but gain everything else. If Dave throws you out, you can always sleep with Paul. Not after what that scumbag did to me. I can't believe they're accusing me of assault. I was just defending myself. That idiot took advantage of me. What? Your work husband took advantage. Of you? Well, coercion in relationships is quite a hot topic right now. All right, Sarah, tell me the rest. You said he was a decent guy, so how exactly did a decent man end up doing that to you? Wendy's sarcasm went unnoticed by Sarah. She paused for a moment before deciding to tell her sister the whole dirty story, no matter how awkward it might be. Well, as I already said, I never had a full night with Paul before. Just a few episodes at the motel and a couple of quickies in the office. So, when Dave said he was going to Ballarat for 3 days, I jumped at the chance to see what Paul was really like. No need to roll your eyes. I get it. You disapprove. This is my life, and it was my choice. I dropped the kids off at your place, had dinner with Paul, and then called Dave like I always do when he's away. How do you do it, Sarah? Do what? You talk to your husband as if nothing is happening. Only Sarah knew the inner demons she faced in the early stages of her office romance with her lover. However, those torturous moments of guilt quickly faded, replaced by the realization that Dave was easy to deceive because he trusted her. She chose to treat her sister's question as rhetorical and ignored it. After I managed to speak with Dave, before he asked to talk to the kids, Paul and I got to it. I have to admit it was a bit of a disappointment. At the motel, it was rushed, different, and fun. When we did it over the desk at work, it was cliché but thrilling. I suppose I had built up the night in my head, and reality just couldn't compete. It felt routine, and dare I say, a bit boring. Paul isn't really into foreplay. I barely had time to think about it before he was on me for the first time. When it was over, he rolled over and fell asleep. He'd already drunk almost an entire bottle of wine at dinner. I dozed off briefly, but woke up with a restless desire. I woke him up by, well, you know. Sarah stopped mid-sentence, noticing her sister's expression. Sorry. You're right. You don't need all the details, do you? Anyway, once he was ready, I didn't want to repeat the same mistake, so I got on top of him, but he told me I needed to take a shower first. I hadn't even gotten the water to the right temperature when Paul joined me, and suddenly all the lights went out. He told me the house was old and the fuses kept tripping. He left, and I heard him fumbling with the bedroom door handle. I thought he was grabbing a flashlight from somewhere and would fix the fuse before coming back to the shower. I waited almost 10 minutes, but he never returned. I called out to him and thought I heard him shout from the bedroom that he was waiting for me in bed. I wondered why he hadn't fixed the fuse, lit a candle, or done something. It was still pitch dark. I turned off the water and called out, but there was no response. I couldn't understand why he was being so irritating. I fumbled around until I found a towel, shouting that I was getting dressed and going home, but my clothes were still in the bedroom. Wendy yawned. It was already very late, and Sarah's words and behavior contradicted her earlier claim about coercion in the relationship. Besides, the story was becoming dull. Sarah quickly continued. I felt my way to the bedroom thinking I'd find the bed, by touch. I knew my clothes were on the floor between the bed and the door. Suddenly, Paul grabbed me from behind and shoved me forward. I fell onto the bed. The next thing I remember, his hands were lifting me by the hips, and I could feel him against me. Dave and I sometimes acted out a forced use scenario. It's my fantasy, so I decided to go along with it and relax a little. Sarah's cheeks grew warm, and knowing she had blushed after confessing one of her fantasies to her sister, she squirmed and lowered her gaze to her hands, absently watching as they twisted the rings on her fingers. Anyway, I felt one of his hands move away from my hip, and a moment later, I noticed something cold being applied. I told Paul he didn't need any of that, as I was already ready. I have to admit the situation was intense. When I felt his hands adjust my position, I shifted to make it easier for him. Sarah paused, clearly uneasy, lost in her thoughts for a few moments. Wendy yawned again, just wishing this uncomfortable and upsetting story would come to an end. And then, without any warning, he shifted in a way that caught me off guard. It was painful, Wendy, really painful. Even now, it still bothers me. Sarah fell silent, shifting uncomfortably in her chair and frowning in pain. The memory of the pain washed over her again, not just the physical pain, but also the sudden realization that someone she thought genuinely cared about her could treat her like that. What did you do? Well, I yelled at him sharply. And what did he do? He just held me tightly and kept going. Damn, it hurts so much. And how did it end? At some point, that idiot must have loosened his grip, which allowed me to break free, and I scrambled across the bed. When I did, my hands felt something strange. Let me backtrack a little. When I first entered Paul's bedroom, there was a baseball bat leaning against the wall near the bed. I asked him about it, and he said there had been a few home invasions in the neighborhood recently, and he wanted to be prepared. Somehow it ended up on the bed. Now that I think about it, it seems odd. For a moment, Sarah's face took on a strange expression. Do you think Paul was planning to use it on me if he couldn't overpower me? Wendy watched Sarah's face as she began to grasp the true nature of her work husband's intentions and how much worse the situation could have been. The color drained from Sarah's face, and she fell silent, prompting Wendy to suggest she continue. And what happened next? Sarah shook herself out of her thoughts and continued. Well, I grabbed the bat with both hands. I turned around and swung it as hard as I could. I felt the impact and heard Paul scream in pain. It was still dark, but I ran back to the bathroom as quickly as possible. I closed the door and fumbled around for the lock until I found it. Oh, Wendy, it was so terrifying. I could hear Paul trying to unlock the door and pounding on it. I knew it wouldn't hold him for long, so I felt around for a window but couldn't figure out how to open it. My foot bumped into a trash can on the floor, so I grabbed it and smashed the window. Then I started screaming and yelling. I saw lights come on in the house next door, so I kept shouting for help and calling for the police. Sarah trembled as she recalled the fear she felt during that moment. And what did Paul do? I don't know, but he stopped trying to get into the bathroom. I waited for 5 or 10 minutes, and although everything was quiet, I was too scared to open the door. Then I heard the siren of a police car. The next thing I remember is a police officer shouting for me to open the door. I did, and I stepped out. There were 2 of them, with flashlights and guns. I was completely naked, so they could see I wasn't a threat, and there was no sign of Paul. I was terrified and ran downstairs. One of the officers followed me while the other stayed in the bedroom. Shortly after, I heard him shouting into his radio, calling for an ambulance. I told the officer with me that I didn't need one. He went back upstairs, grabbed my clothes, and I got dressed. He then led me to the police car and started asking me a bunch of questions. I told him how Paul had taken advantage of me and how I had hit him. They took me to the hospital, where they ran some tests and then brought me here. They took my official statement and then asked if I needed a lawyer. Of course, I said no. Then they charged me with assaulting Paul and took my fingerprints. They found Paul unconscious near the bed. After that, they told me they'd hold me here until tomorrow's bail hearing. Naturally, I couldn't call Dave, so I called you. Sarah looked at her sister pleadingly, hoping Wendy would help her feel less alone and confused. Wendy considered finding a police officer and asking why her sister had been charged in what seemed like an obvious case of self-defense. Nevertheless, her sister's pitiful state tugged at Wendy. Sarah always had a talent for making others take care of her, and Wendy felt she shouldn't leave Sarah on her own. I really don't understand how you're planning to keep Dave in the loop about all this. What's your plan? Well, once Paul regains consciousness, he'll tell them I only hit him in self-defense, and they'll drop the assault charges. Wendy looked at her naive sister with pity. She knew that for Sarah to be exonerated, Paul would have to admit to coercion in the relationship. And while Wendy didn't know the man, someone who seduced a married woman was unlikely to be that noble. She was spared the agonizing task of explaining this to her desperate sister when a plainclothes detective entered the room and asked her to leave. After Wendy left, the detective settled into the vacant chair and alternated between looking at Sarah and reading her statement. Sarah tried to read his expression, hoping Paul had told the truth. Finally, the detective set the document aside and addressed the hopeful woman. So let me clarify, Mrs. Brown. For several months, you've been having an illicit affair with your work husband behind your husband's back. On the evening your husband was out of town, you decided to spend the night at your lover's house. During sex, you interrupted to take a shower, at which point the power went out. When your lover did not return, you returned to the bedroom where you claim he attacked you and used force. You then found a baseball bat on the bed and hit him once. Is that correct? Yes, I've already told you everything. Has Paul regained consciousness? He needs to confirm that everything I said is true. No. I'm afraid he hasn't regained consciousness. In fact, it's my duty to inform you that you've gone from being a work wife to a work widow. Mr. Paul Smith died without regaining consciousness, after being found on the bedroom floor between the bed and the wall with severe multiple head injuries. Doctors say he was struck up to 7 times, mostly while he was lying on the floor, likely unconscious. The baseball bat found at the scene had fingerprints on it, yours and the deceased's. Sarah Brown, you are being charged with second-degree murder. I remind you that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. At that moment, Sarah fainted. Apologue. Dave Brown wished the two police officers a good night before they left the room and reviewed his answers to their recent questions. Yes, he had checked into a motel in Ballarat earlier that afternoon, around 5 Li. He had an early dinner at the motel restaurant, which he was confident could be confirmed by his waitress, a red-haired woman, about 35, wearing glasses. Then, unfortunately, he retired to his room, where he was alone and without witnesses, preparing for the resumption of his business meeting the next day. The only phone call he made or received was from his wife's mobile phone around 9:30. Now that he thought about it, it seemed a little odd that she used her mobile instead of the home phone. No, he didn't know Paul Smith, nor had he ever interacted with his wife's colleagues from work. Couldn't they at least tell him what was going on? After the officers left, he called both the home phone and Sarah's mobile. He left worried messages, asking her to call him back. While considering his next move, he rubbed his bruised bicep and absent-mindedly slipped his hands into his pants pockets. Feeling something soft, he pulled the contents out of his pocket and stared wearily at the two latex gloves in his hand. He smirked wryly at his oversight. If the police had searched him, it could have ruined all his carefully laid plans. The thought made him pause, and he cursed himself for not being thorough enough. His children needed him to be more focused. Pulling back the curtains, he confirmed that the police car had left. Then he stepped out of the room, crossed the road, and headed to the back of the shopping center. Looking around to ensure no one was watching, he reached into his pocket again and tossed everything into a dumpster, where they joined a pair of night vision goggles, a disposable coverall, and an intact fuse box he had discarded earlier. Returning to his room, he began packing his things despite his exhaustion, carefully planning all the steps he needed to take to become a successful single parent. A smile played on his lips at the thought of the difficult work he had done, and done quite well. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next episode of English Epics. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.